think Oz, we'll start the recording now, but Oz was just telling us about some of the fun things he was reading on r/, I keep wanting to call it Christian Dead Bedrooms. Is it Christian marriage advice? Marriage advice is really what it is?
Just Christian marriage, and it might as well be Dead Bedrooms, or maybe Dying Bedrooms is a better way to put it.
So tell us your adventures exploring there.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been trolling on it too long going through the posts, but it doesn't take long before you start hitting some pretty obviously unhelpful stuff. So post right now titled, "Is it wrong to have physical standards?" Pretty common question out there, unfortunately. And top rated comment, the only thing I would suggest is to get to know these women, at least as friends. Attraction can grow when you get to know a person. Also, maybe ask yourself if physical standards meet the standards you have for yourself. Yeah, I mean, attraction can definitely grow when you get to know someone, and it can also totally fall apart because you realize that they're just an empty shell of a person. So that one's particularly fun. Yeah, there was one I was reading earlier about basically the common, well, I'm not getting satisfactory sex in my marriage. What can I do about it? And oh man, some of the advice amounted to, I mean, it's kind of some of the cliches like chore play, you need to serve more. And then probably one that came up more than often than anything else and most highly upvoted was you need to pursue your wife, and other kind of trivialities that way. And it basically comes down to hey, if you do X, then she will do this, and it becomes this like manipulation. And then it's funny because then there's like the overt part of the contract, which is they say, oh, and make sure you communicate your expectations. And I was reminded there was a podcast, and I think it's still out there. I haven't listened to it in years and years. It's called, I think, One Extraordinary Marriage, and it's these two Christian couple, and they literally schedule sex during their week, and they advocate this as a strategy. And it's pretty outrageous to think that like that's the best that they have to offer, and they're that's something that would actually be an improvement in a lot of Christian sex lives. It's at least you're having sex twice a week in that case. And it just goes to show just how far off mark I think the church has been when it comes to any kind of standards or expectations or knowledge around how the sexual dynamic works in a marriage.
So what do you guys take on scheduling sex?
Well, I personally, when I get married, I'm going to schedule sex 5 times a day. So I don't see it as a problem. Definitely.
That is not the first time I've heard that in a Christian environment. I didn't go through the Sunday school class, but I had exposure to some Sunday school material. I'm struggling now to remember what it was called. Maybe it'll come to me later. But one of the key points as I was reviewing the material was, like Oz says, pursue her, communicate, but it was also schedule it. And I was like, wow, that's can't be.
That sounds like love and respect.
Yeah,
man. It's just like imagine you had
places as well.
Yeah, imagine you had a car that you knew was gonna blow a transmission every so often, so you just scheduled a transmission replacement every three weeks or something like that. Everybody would be like, dude, the underlying issue is clearly just something is wrong with the car. We should probably actually fix this, not just schedule some sort of critical maintenance every now and then.
Well, I kind of take a middle of the road approach to that. I don't see anything wrong with scheduling it per se, as long as it's not a set schedule. There's value in laying down the idea that, hey, what's going to happen tonight ahead of time and building some anticipation. Sometimes, as long as it's not a routine, every week's going to be the same thing. These 2 days, this particular way, and no opportunity for any spontaneity any other time. I think that it can, like I said, throw it in there a little bit. And I don't see, anticipation can be a good thing. I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that as long as it's not your basic approach to doing it. I think it's just one tool out of many. I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing unless that is the total sum of your.
Depending on the dynamics. I think it depends on the dynamics. If it's the man saying, hey, I'm too busy, so if you want sex with me, we need to schedule it. Versus if the woman says, I'm too busy. You need to schedule sex with me. And obviously, then there's the third split case where both of you guys are so busy. And that's usually for a small season, not a lifetime. And if it is, you guys should probably rework your guys' schedules to, spend some more time together, unless you just hate each other and then you got married for the wrong reasons or something.
Yeah.
Well, doesn't that strategy of scheduling really take game completely out of it? The whole
depends.
pursuing, flirting, escalation.
It depends. I'm working 72 hours a week. If if I don't
Sounds
make
like
some
a
sort
week.
of yeah.
So to kind of to dive in here and challenge a little bit, I think it's part of a matter of, okay, assuming that people are working a relatively normal schedule where things could happen more frequently than whatever, twice a week, I think is what this couple subscribes to. If that becomes the only times that it's on the table and it happens, then I think there's a desire issue at play. It's not, I'm so busy, and if we want to make this happen, we're just gonna have to set time aside for it. Okay, that's a little bit different than we have time, but we just don't have the chemistry, the desire built up to actually go with it. And so I think the schedule becomes a way for him to get enough that he's not completely starving to death, and her to feel like she's, offering her, starfish duty sex periodically enough to keep him satisfied enough that he's not totally starving. And I just don't see that as a satisfactory arrangement for most men, at least. And I doubt most women.
And that's exactly how I feel about it. Working as many hours as I do, yeah, it becomes a matter of, sometimes I just need to make sure I have enough gas in the tank at the end of the day to be able to make something happen. And knowing ahead of time can be valuable sometimes. But yeah, if that's the only way, and yeah, it's just crumbs, that becomes a whole different thing. Instead, not necessarily the only tool in the toolbox, but you know what, with the amount of hours I work, yeah, sometimes it's nice to know ahead of time that it's going to happen. And I don't face a desire issue in my marriage either at all. So that definitely makes a huge difference. I mean, if on a Saturday or on a Sunday, 2:00 in the afternoon, I'm like, hey, let's go. She's like, all right, cool. So
What time do you go to work, Chuck?
I leave at 5:30 in the morning, get home about 6:30 in the evening.
Perfect. If you wake up at 5, if you wake up half an hour earlier, your testosterone spikes. It's 60% higher for the first 30 minutes of the day. So you can just use that, I don't know, tease her right before you go to bed, let her mind work up while she's dreaming, and then boom, you don't even have to worry about having enough in the tank for the rest of the day because you just knocked you out of the ballpark before you even left.
Bro, I get up at 4:30 in the morning and I don't go to bed till about 10:30 at night. And that's just getting ready and everything else. So yeah, I get about 6.5 hours of sleep a night, and that's without anything else. If I'm going to make time for it that evening, I go to bed earlier. So yeah, not always possible.
It's worth a shot.
But hey, I appreciate the suggestion. But no, my wife's down to fool around anytime. Really, 100% of the time.
Man.
I've never gotten a no, unless she's angry at me, and then hey, it's twice as good the next day.
So I'm just going to pitch this one out here. I'm reading another title of a post in that sub. My wife confessed to be asexual. Don't know where to go next. Press F to pay respects. Whew.
She's asexual.
I've had that conversation before, by the way.
Yeah, you want to elaborate a little bit here? What would be your advice to this guy?
Oh, goodness. So my wife had made that comment at one point of, I just don't ever think of sex. I don't need it. And I could go the rest of my life without it. And for years, I believed that that's just who she was. Of course, I obviously didn't know anything about how actual sexual dynamics worked in marriage. And I was not the most attractive person. And it turns out I just wasn't very attractive. And that's why she didn't care. And so once I started initiating, and so I think that what people in that situation need to recognize is that there's a difference between spontaneous and reactive sexuality. A lot of men just assume that their wives should be spontaneous the way that they are. Guys tend to get a hard on for the smallest tiny little things, and then we're good to go. And yet for women, they need somebody to get them revved up for a while, and that usually takes a man initiating with them. And once that happens, then the attraction builds pretty quickly and the arousal goes up, and all of a sudden she's ready and a sexual being again. But when guys go in expecting that their wives are going to be spontaneous like they are, that's where you get the problem. And I feel like as soon as you drop that expectation and start working toward things like Keno and working on your passive game and your active game, all of that really helps.
Yeah, I'm reading through some of the advice here, and pretty much basically blaming hormones on the issue.
Man.
Yeah.
My first.
It's easy to blame things out of your control, right?
Yeah, my first initial reaction, Oz, would be to tell the guy, like, okay, where's the low-hanging fruit? Like, that guy that I'm kind of like mentoring / discipling, he's over on the East Coast. He's the guy that I think he's been on RPC here and there, and I think John deleted one of his posts. It was low quality. And he messages me, and he's like, hey, here's this conversation with this girl, da-da-da-da. And, he posted it. Anyways, so I finally was just like, dude, I asked him all these why questions. I was like, why don't girls like you? And he's like, oh, because of this. Everything was external. And so I was just like, dude, you're narcissistic. Everything is outside your control. The things that are inside your control, you don't want to do anything about, so you have no grounds to complain. And apparently he was a snowflake and said F off and you're a tyrant. And that gave me some emotional validation. I was really happy after that.
You triggered him.
I triggered him. Oh, man. That was after like a month and a half, 2 months of, gently giving him advice. So, but yeah, I went through asking the 5 whys. I think the 5 whys, you can really get to a root of a problem. And then, in the case you're talking about, that guy might be able to, see some low hanging fruit, like getting jacked. That's the lowest hanging fruit, and usually gets the ladies wet.
So let me ask this. We were talking about, scheduling sex, and one of the things that makes me curious about is we sometimes talk about this concept of covert contracts. Isn't scheduling sex like the exact opposite of that? Because now you're being overt and you're saying, hey, I'm intending this. Let's put it on the books. Isn't that a good thing? Why shouldn't you do it? Just to play devil's advocate for a second.
I wouldn't. Oh, go ahead.
It's kind of both, because you're scheduling it with the expectation, but there's also that covert part where there is the expectation that she's going to respond positively and say yes. So it's kind of it's both in the same fell swoop, really.
And not just respond positively by saying yes, but that the quality when you get there will be what you're expecting. Because that's what I've found is with scheduled sex, which I haven't done in years, but when we used to do that, it was subpar because there was no context to it, no build up, no real expectation of foreplay. And for me, like foreplay, sometimes I try to think of it as being, starting hours before you actually initiate or get going, right? Because you want to start the build and the arousal, at the beginning of the day, ideally. So sometimes it's something as simple as I get home from work, stick my arms around her from behind and, just kind of sway with her a little bit. Just something to increase that physical contact and get her thinking. And anyway, you guys get the point of that. But what I'm getting at is ultimately that there's got to be something that builds up to it for the quality to really be there. But if you're just jumping in cold, I don't know. I've never really cared for that.
Well, but if you're going to do that, yeah.
I was going to say, since you are living it right now, while you're not home, how are you building up that foreplay while you're at work?
Good question.
How's your text game?
You sending her some special pictures while you head to the the restroom?
All right,
Tell
everybody's
her.
gonna start thinking about Patrick giving dick pics now.
No. She would not respond well to that. Maybe a little ab shot here or there, or my text game's pretty on point. I'll just hit her up for no reason sometimes. Middle of the day, or when I get to work or something, and try to respond if she texts me and needs something, or just says hi, and try to keep it friendly, a little sexual sometimes.
How do you? So you do lay some sexy talk in there, little lingo.
Oh, sure, little innuendo. Plus, she speaks Croatian, so I'll use
That is so
some.
cool.
That is sick. Brownie points.
I know the words, and I'll throw them in there, and that always touches a special button because.
What's the Croatian word for titties?
Sisis.
Sisis. Okay. Some nice sisis.
Yeah, dick is kuras.
Kuras. Okay. Well, I don't need to remember that one, but sisis.
So I'll do that, and then as far as Kino, when I get home, the problem is a lot of people do Kino when they want it to lead to something, and the rest of the time they're kind of like, they're friendly, and they want it to lead to more, but there's a subtle difference in the way Kino is applied when a man is trying to take it towards things happening in the bedroom that night. And I think a key is your Kino needs to be on point all the time. She needs to not be able to sense the difference when it's going to lead to something and when it's not going to lead to something. She should always feel that desire from you, no matter what.
It took me a while to figure that out.
It should be genuine. And the problem is, for a lot of guys, it's only genuine when they're planning on getting some that night. And she knows. She knows. Women know. They know. They're way better at this stuff in a lot of ways than we are. And so,
see, I'm going to just challenge a little bit of the idea that there has to be a differentiation between the two. I think if there's an audience around, I mean, yeah, take that into account. But like, my wife and I are very touchy-feely people in general, and there's not a lot of like subtlety sometimes. I don't make a distinction between, hey, this is me just applying Kino because I just want to be there and make you feel good, versus like this could lead somewhere. It's pretty much understood across the board that like it could lead somewhere, and she's very receptive of that. And I think that you kind of have to establish a bit of a baseline, and I never anymore get any kind of pushback of like, oh, you just want one thing. Like, that's never really been our dynamic, because that's always been pretty much understood. Like, yeah, that's always on the table.
Yes, and you said it better than I was. That's exactly what I was trying to say there. But for a lot of guys, that's not the case. There's a clear difference. And as long as there's a clear difference, then she's always going to know when you're trying to take it
the
direction of the bedroom. And she'll differentiate because you already are, even if you don't think you are. A lot of guys don't figure, like John said, didn't figure it out for a long time. I've definitely been more aware of the difference over the last few years since I've been around RP, and definitely have been better at being genuine all the time. Yes, always on the table, could always lead somewhere, but many times it doesn't. And many times it's just, hey, I'm a sexual guy. I'm going to touch you. I'm going to grab your ass. And if you don't like it, well, go ahead. Get upset with me. And then I'm just going to smack it. Because it's always on the table. And she knows that. She knows it could always lead somewhere. But that doesn't mean it's always going to. But it's not any different when I'm intending it to lead somewhere versus when I'm not. At least, not that I can tell these days.
So do you ever intend it to lead somewhere and then it doesn't, and then let that affect you?
The only time it doesn't lead somewhere is if she ends up not feeling well that night for some reason. And it's usually genuine, based on some emotional thing, or just really tired or worn out, and you know what? Hey, 99% of the time, if I want it to be on, it's on. Like I said, I don't get a no. If I get a
So
no,
let me do this then. Let's travel back in time a little bit, right? To a time before you started figuring some of this stuff out and getting your life in order. And you were getting those rejections, or this is really open for any guy, not just necessarily you, Patrick. But I'm guessing that there's a lot of people out there who really do struggle with the idea of trying to do things, expecting it to turn into sex, and then it doesn't. And how do you handle that? How do you react? What's the problem with making those expectations in the first place, right?
I would say for me, it was never that it wouldn't lead somewhere, because my wife's always been exceptional in that area about being accommodating. It's the level of engagement and interest that was always the difference for me. If she knew it was leading somewhere intentionally in the past versus other times when I was just being friendly and, you know,
If I can just interrupt here momentarily.
yeah.
John asked earlier about, what's wrong with scheduling it if it's essentially an overt contract. And I think in a sense, like if that's something a guy is satisfied with, if that truly is a satisfactory dynamic and nobody feels like they're missing something, like knock yourself out. I would much prefer, I think most people would prefer that dynamic over being constantly butthurt because you're being rejected in your advances, or there's just a complete misunderstanding of what the expectations are. That said, it's kind of like there's a lot of diabetics that are okay with taking their insulin, and that's enough to make them happy enough in life. But a lot of them, if they would just work out and get off their butts, they wouldn't have to. And I think that's kind of the difference here is like, yeah, if you're willing to settle for a mediocre, like vanilla, super plain existence that way, and if that's satisfactory to you, knock yourself out. Not going to lose any sleep over it. But most of the guys I have ever known and met would not be satisfied with that. It would be purely a Band-Aid to stop a bullet wound.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it. I would say there's nothing wrong with vanilla once in a while, but I like other flavors too. So yeah, as long as it's not your only choice of ice cream, then you're good. For me, yeah, it had to do more with level of engagement. I may not be the best person to ask about that because, like I said, I have yet to receive a hard no unless she's just not feeling well, which is rare, really. So I've been very super abundantly overly blessed in that area. So that's not a question I can answer in the same way as some other people, I guess.
Anybody else have experience here with some no's? As a single man, I can't really speak on this, nor can I. Before I had some low quality sex before I was a Christian, and I've had a lot of high quality sex before I was a Christian.
And he walks away.
And he walks away.
Yeah. What?
I was married before, and I could say my dynamic was totally different. So I do understand the other side of it from that aspect, but we're talking a different person, a different time. We're talking before Christ, and we're talking before RP. I didn't know any of this stuff. So I can only critically
examine
it.
That's what I'm trying to ask about,
hindsight.
though, right? Because I'm trying to talk about guys who are in that position, who are maybe just figuring out their faith. They haven't studied what the scripture says on this. They're not applying it yet. And so ultimately, they're stuck in these tough relationships, which is where I was when I first found the red pill, right? That's what brings a lot of guys in, is this idea that, man, I'm in a really tough, struggling relationship. All kinds of things are going wrong. I keep trying to do these things to get sex, and it's not working. I expect it, but if for some reason I can't figure out why isn't she holding up her end, right? And the church just tells these guys over and over and over again, if you're just, you be a good, godly man, and you read your Bible, and you go to work, and you provide, then she will love you and appreciate you. It doesn't matter that you're 400 pounds and that you just watch sports all day long. She'll just be all over you because of your godliness, right?
Yeah.
Does it actually work that way?
No. In fact, it works.
And that can manifest in so many ways. It can be through chore play. That if I if I do the dishes, or if I get the kids squared away, or if I clean the house, and it's going to reduce her stress, and then the stars are going to align. Or it can be because I'm a good provider. I bring home the bacon, and I have a great career, so that should translate to good sex. There are a
Andes.
number of those type of um, transactional type mindsets that guys can become entrapped in.
Well, and I think it's more than just getting trapped in. I think that's kind of the ongoing marital doctrine of the church is essentially if you are godly, you will be sexy. And there seems to be this misunderstanding that their nature doesn't just stop when you become a Christian. All of those things that apply in secular areas when it comes to attraction, by and large, still pertain. And that seems to be a huge miss in the church. And I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've either heard or been given the advice of essentially, hey, shore play, you got to pursue her. You got to do all these things to try and basically create an environment or a circumstance in which she feels the desire or something, or feels like she is obligated, which is never what a guy wants anyways. And I think it really just comes down to a misunderstanding of the natural biology that's taking place. And ultimately, I think guys, they get that. I think there's a huge amount of dissatisfaction in the church around this issue, which is another reason why we see so many marriages being negatively affected by infidelity, porn, the rest of it on both sides of the male-female spectrum there. And it's, I think a huge disservice to guys when they don't get the advice, which most often the time is quit being a pussy, figure yourself out, get on your own mission. For goodness sake, start looking like somebody who your wife might be interested in. That would all be much better advice than most of what's given out there. There was a helpful post I read somewhere on TRP, which was essentially, we often use like the Christian Brad Pitt example. Well, would your wife be asexual if the Christian version of Brad Pitt showed up? Yeah, probably not. And so the odds are you're not attractive to her. That's why she's asexual for you. And I think that point would kind of labor pretty well, and it's a good point. I think the flip side of that too is imagine if Rosie O'Donnell came up to you and she wanted to serve you into being aroused by her. Is there any level of service that she could provide or offer that would ever cause you to experience real sexual desire? Like, probably not, right? And so I think that basically what the church is saying, hey guys, you're basically the Rosie O'Donnell here, and you need to do things to get her aroused, not you have to be a person who causes desire.
But don't forget the way that people,
the church does. Okay. I was gonna say the other thing the church does so much is you have to communicate on it, and to bring up Rollo's rule, it flies right in the face of that. It's basically the church is saying you have to negotiate attraction.
Yeah, and so as part of that, what I noticed is in my own relationship. So I'm married to my wife early on, and never once did she try to pull the chore play card of, oh, maybe if you did more chores around the house, I'd have sex with you more. Until the pastor preached a sermon about, oh, guys, if you want your wife to be more sexual with you, then maybe you should do things to make her feel more relaxed and at peace. And a clean house can make her feel more comfortable and at ease, and she might be more receptive to your advances. And then all of a sudden, my wife is saying, oh, well, maybe if you did more chores and I was more relaxed and felt at peace, but I just can't stop thinking about all the things that need cleaned when we're in the bedroom. Like, really? I seriously doubt any woman is really sitting in her bed at night, laying down next to you thinking, oh man, I can't believe those dishes are still there, right? It just doesn't happen that way. But as soon as the church gives them an excuse, you better believe they're going to take it.
Well, that's true. But on the other hand, I think being a captain and handling your business overall, handling your responsibilities, creates the environment where it's easier to set the stage for success in that area.
Let's talk about that though. So let's ask specifically about the difference between having a covert contract of, oh, if I do these things, she'll give me sex, versus being a strong man that's actually desirable and who does the same things that a covert contract man does. How would you distinguish?
It's all
between
about mindset.
There you go.
It all comes down to a mindset of, are you doing it so that you'll get something in return, so that your wife will respond? Or are you doing it because you have ownership over your sphere, because you want a clean house, because your kids need, because your wife needs help, because it was a stressful day? Or are you doing it so that you can get something back, so that you can fulfill a covert contract? So it all comes down to your mindset. Are you acting as a captain, or are you the nice guy?
So how can two different guys, because that's the exact right answer, but how can two different guys have the exact same behaviors externally that their wife sees, yet with two different mindsets, and that mindset alone gives them two different results?
Because if he's doing it as a covert contract to get something, she'll sense it, she'll know, and it'll automatically become a covert contract because she will just innately understand that on a level that I think a lot of guys just don't get. And they know when you're faking it. They know when you have an agenda. They know when you're after something. And they also know when you're being genuine, when you're being a leader, when you have your stuff on lock, when you're doing everything you're supposed to do. And that's attractive. That's genuine attractiveness. The other is trying to fake being attractive by doing what we think is supposed to happen to reach a desired goal. They know the difference. Innately, they know the difference.
And this goes back to the idea that go ahead.
I was going to say, and your reaction when, not if, when you get rejected. Are you butthurt? Are you affected by that? Or are you like, whatever, I got other stuff to do, No big
well,
deal.
this is where secular RP really kind of takes it all the way to the other extreme too, because if you get those genuine rejections enough times when you're doing everything you're supposed to do, then they're like, well, you know what? It's only going to happen so many times, and then, hey, my needs are going to get met no matter what. And you can either be part of that, or you can continue doing what you're doing and I'll still get my needs met. You just won't have the chance. You had first shot. And I think for a lot of people, Christians and non-Christians, that's the direction that it ends up going a lot of times. And the devil knows. He knows he's going to put that temptation in there. And so there is a responsibility not only to the marriage and to each other as spouses, but to God, for both sides to do their part and try to make it work and be genuine, rather than allow the dynamic to go so far that direction that people end up making sinful choices.
So getting back to the question that John had asked real quick, about what's the difference between a guy who does all the behaviors and there's a covert contract and he doesn't get the results that he's looking for, and then there's a guy who's doing those things and yet is doing it from a place of strength essentially, and his wife responds accordingly. What's going on there? Well, I think some of it has to do with like status, right? And so one of the things I wonder is, and I ask myself, is this a behavior that she would exhibit toward the king or the A-list movie star actor or whatever? I mean, keeping in mind AWOL, like women will do some crazy things and bend over backwards and have some, all kinds of weird justifications, like the gas station bathroom or something is a place where some women are willing to throw down with the right guy, but then they go, that same woman in her own house with her husband may be like, no, you didn't take out the trash, so like you're so irresponsible. There's a difference of expectation there, and there's a difference of status involved there. So I think a helpful question is this a behavior that would be exhibited towards somebody that she saw as the chief of the tribe or something to that effect? I think most often we would think, no, probably not. And so I think it's actually gets back to like 1 Peter 3:6 and a misunderstanding thereof of the ordering of things. So it says, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, like most women look at her husband and say, Lord, like master, like somebody who is in a position of authority and respect among myself and the tribe, and somebody who's of this high status? Like, probably not. And I sometimes, most of the time, frankly, rightfully so, because the guy's too busy playing video games and being overweight to go for it. So something to think about as far as the status angle of it.
All right, so to pause here, do we want to resume? Yeah, let me go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna bow out.
Okay.
All right.
All right, Skim. See you later, bro. See you
Later,
on
dude.
the
Later,
other
man.
side, guys.
Have a great night.
While we're waiting for Levi to rejoin us, I was thinking, there's something I was thinking about a little earlier. When was the last time as men, Christian men, we looked at a Christian girl and said, wow, she is like the godliest girl I have ever seen in my life. That turns me on so much. No, never. Because godliness is attractive from a spiritual perspective, but attractiveness from a physical perspective, we don't look at godliness and see it as manifesting in desirability for another person, at least not physical desirability. It's not an attraction thing. It's a spiritual connection thing, but I think that's on a different level.
Yeah, there's a difference between desirable or valuable traits to want in a person that intellectually hey, that's the kind of person and qualities that I'm looking for, versus the biological process of when my eyes perceive this, my dick does that, right? And so there's got to be some kind of a distinguishing when people look at those types of situations of, what is it that I'm saying that I want versus what actually gets me sexually aroused.
Exactly. And yet the church teaches men to be that women will be aroused by godliness.
Yeah. So Levi, I know you as the single guy, especially in a covert contract situation, have to some degree felt out a little bit, but I do have a question for the single guys, because I'm sure that as much as the concept of covert contracts is discussed on TRP and MRP and all that, there are a lot of single guys out there who read this stuff, and for a Christian single guy especially, who's not necessarily thinking about entering into sexual relationships, is there a similar concept of covert contracts when it comes to asking out a girl? And like one of the things that comes to mind is one of the guys that I disciple is he's kind of funny, but every time he goes on Tinder or OkCupid or Christian Mingle or anything like that, he starts developing these expectations about how girls should respond to him that aren't necessarily aligned with reality. Tell me a little bit, what's your experience with things like that?
Yeah, well, before I found RP Christians, I guess covert, gosh, okay, a covert contract. I definitely thought that if I had a solid intro and got the number, that it was, it would turn into a date. And especially if we set up a date, then it was definitely a date. And that just, there was multiple times where that just didn't happen. And so that's like really frustrating. There was this one girl, and man, it was so awesome. Hit it off, boom, phone number, boom, scheduled something, boom, and then she just blew me off. And I was like, what the F? And I texted her, and I was like, so I'm here. She's like, oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot. I was like, okay, like, so you want to try this again? And boom, same thing happened. And after that, I was just like, okay. It was a hard lesson of just watch for actions, and that's all you can really count on is actions. And then if they line up after a while, then that's great. And then also, I haven't really had much problems with covert contracts with like girlfriends. I've had a couple girlfriends since I've been a Christian, and one of Okay, the first one, there was some covert contracts going on actually, and there was a lot of miscommunication. That was early into my red pill journey. And then the second one, everything went pretty well because I just conveyed expectations really, really, like I was just really forward with everything. And by her action, she loved it. So apparently, like, she had some complaints, but I never heard of them. So
Well,
So
one thing that
that
I was going to say, it kind of almost sounds as though it's like overt contracts revealing that a lot of women are very flaky and, unreliable. And I think that's increasingly true. I've been married for a little over 7 years now, and it was bad then. But from what I've seen with my friends, it's worse now that people have their digital tether with them all the time, and there's always one more thing that's more interesting coming up. So I think that makes for a pretty hard marketplace, so to speak. One thing that comes to mind when you asked Levi about the covert contracts that exist in the church among singles, and maybe this is like a regional thing or not, but I think it extends beyond that. Before my wife and I were dating, there was this idea that if you ask a girl out and she says yes in the church, that you're about to get married. Like there's this really weird like acceleration. It was like coffee, and it's like, oh, so you went out to coffee. When's the wedding? And you're like, what the hell are you talking about? And it's weird, but that was kind of my experience. And
it's
there was like,
everywhere.
yeah, and it's like I don't know where we kind of got that started in the culture, but it's really kind of debilitating in a lot of ways because people's expectations are sky high rather than, it really works against the idea of developing abundance mentality and being able to screen and being able to get yourself in front of a handful of people so you can start seeing trends and patterns in behavior. And it wasn't until I kind of gave up on the idea of like, well, screw it, I don't care what other people think. It's just a coffee date. They can, take whatever they want away from it, but it's not what is real. And I went and met more women and went on more dates like that I started seeing some of the patterns of behavior, that some that I liked, some that I didn't. But again, building up that abundance mentality that probably wouldn't have been possible if it was like, oh, we went on a date, I guess we're gonna get married now, and we get to have this lovely story about how the very first girl I ever asked out on a date, we're married now, yay chastity. And that's I think actually more destructive in expectation than it is helpful.
That's so funny you say that. There was literally, like, I was talking to the worship pastor of the church I was a Christian in, or I became a Christian in, and it was like him, the head pastor, and like another pastor, and me. And I used to be like pretty plugged in with just helping around and doing stuff. And so Isaac was the worship pastor, or one of the worship leaders, and he's like, was talking to the main pastor. He's like, if I go ask a girl like for her number, and then the same sermon I ask another girl for her number, like I'm considered a player. And the main pastor was like, what? Like, dude, like women need to chill out. And this was weird because he wasn't really an like red pill pastor. Really awesome dude. But he's like, dude, it's just like you're not even friends at that point. Just get to know each other. Like it's a coffee date. But still, it was weird. And that was in Oregon, or is in Oregon. And so the size of church I was in also, I was kind of dealing with a little bit of a scorched earth where, people would notice if you help out to any capacity, like people notice you, people know who you are, and word gets around like, oh, that guy has gone on dates with multiple girls or whatever. And then it's just difficult.
I think you're dealing with the Disney fantasy thing there because, hey, the first one you go with, happily ever after, that's what you're dealing with. Dealing with that whole dynamic because that's what they expect. That's what they've been raised to believe. That's what they fantasize over. And so, yeah, you ask a girl out for coffee. Well, of course, it should be happily ever after because she's a great girl and you're a great guy. And it should be just, oh, well, God's in it. So, of course, it's going to work. It's the Disney fantasy church version.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to throw out another covert contract out here that I think is fairly prevalent, which is, all right, so you save yourself for marriage, you act totally chaste up until wedding day, and then suddenly you're married, you say those magic words, and the switch flips, and this girl who has been told her whole life that sex is dirty and something to be avoided is now going to be swinging from the chandeliers like a porn star or something. You know, it's like, it's just going to be this wild, freaky, you know, like crazy kink fest or something like that. And I think there's a lot of guys out there who that's their expectation when they get into marriage, and then they get there and she's like, I guess we could, and you go, holy crap, what did I get myself into? This is definitely different than I was leading or led to expect. And so I'm interested in your guys' thoughts on this and maybe where this comes from and what can be done about it, because I think that those mismatched expectations I have some thoughts on it, but I'm curious what you guys are saying, because it definitely ends up setting up a lot of marriages for some rocky first years.
I
I
have
lived through that.
John, you want to go? I have a good buddy who experienced exactly what you said.
Mm-hmm. No, that was what I remember. Probably 3 months before we were married, I started expressing some of those questions and concerns, especially as my wife was, or at the time we were, of course, engaged, started taking birth control. The understanding was that it would take some time for that to start affecting your biology. So she wanted to do that before our actual wedding day. And in doing so, I started getting worried about all the things I was reading about how it would affect libido. And because, and at the time, all we were doing was making out, but I had started seeing a decline in the interest in that as she was starting to take the birth control. And so I started getting worried, and she keeps assuring me, oh, no, it's just because there's a lot of stress from all the wedding planning and doing this and doing that. And I promise, once we get married, I'll be jumping all over you. Right? That was like an overt like vow that she was making to me. I will be all over you. You know, I will be totally on top of this. And then of course we get married and nothing even close to that happens. And it is something that I found with other guys that I've discipled, a pretty common affair. It's not unique to me in any way, shape, or form. And like Oz was saying, it's just part of what the church teaches to guys, is it just to expect that things will be great, even though it's not realistic. And then some people in premarital counseling will have these conversations where the counselor, whether it's a pastor or an actual counselor, whoever does it, will usually try to bring what they would call their hard truth, right? Oh, it's not going to be everything you hoped and dreamed, and there's going to be difficulties to go along with this. But at the same time, they're always couching it in but it's going to be wonderful and so perfect and this, right? And you don't really know what to believe, because as much as they're trying to tell you the truth, they're trying to be so optimistic about it that they're not giving you any real pattern or guideline to follow.
Well, yeah, I absolutely hate advice like that. And so many guys, this is how my life is going to be when I have a wife. Like, I was legitimately having this conversation with multiple guys on Saturday, because we did a little mini barn raising. It was awesome. But they're like, oh, Levi, you can't do that when you're married, or like, it's not going to be like that when you have a wife. I'm just like, just trying to be like a mini Paul, guys. He was single, giving advice to the married. But, once I'm married, then I'll be able to say, like, guys, life is awesome. Sex from the chandeliers is great. How you doing down there? Exactly like that. But thing is going to be so nice when I'm finally, I shouldn't say so nice when I'm finally married. Maybe that's a bit of a covert contract. But there's, based on what I know and my past experience with my, string of girlfriends, I have a lot of confidence that I'll be able to say, guys, like, I'm living the life that I talk about, and if you're not, then you can change that. But if you like living that life, it's cool.
Yeah, I think something that comes up too is like the expectations, I think, are somewhat set in the church because the experience of like very healthy marital sex is so uncommon that people genuinely will give the advice of like, well, just lower your expectations, because what you see in the movies, or you've seen porn, and like none of that's actually ever real or going to happen. It's all purely Hollywood. So just lower your expectations away from that, because that's all totally fictitious. And it's like, as somebody who has definitely had a robust sex life with his wife that, is we'll just say beyond what Hollywood portrays, and much better than any of that. I can say that those expectations are not unrealistic. They can be more challenging to get to, but that's not something that we need to set a lower bar for. And so I think sometimes people give the wrong advice instead of saying, hey, let's figure out how to get to that point. They say, well, that point just doesn't exist. So let's just shore it in a little bit.
I think that is absolutely key, is setting proper expectations to begin with. For those people that aren't married yet, you need to know what you expect as a man, and you need to convey those expectations clearly. When my wife and I were dating, that's what we did. That's what I did. Now, keep in mind, my wife had been married once before to an abusive man. She'd been single for a while. She never did enjoy sex, never tried anything besides regular missionary sex. A few times, enough to get pregnant a couple times. That was it. Now we're a little older, so we got married. But before we were married, I laid it out. I said, look, I'll let you know. This is what I told her. I said, if we get married, I'm gonna let you know up front, I'm gonna need a lot of sex. And if that's a problem for you, then you need to let me know, and we probably should stop dating at this point and go our separate ways. And she looked at me and she said, well, if you marry me, that'll never be a problem. And it never has been. And I made it clear, there's certain things that I do enjoy. Those would be non-negotiable. And that I would expect her to maybe not do those things right away, but she would learn. And she expressed a willingness to learn and the desire to please me. And so I think that's key, setting expectations from the beginning and then sticking to them and leading directly towards those, but gently.
So to play a little bit of the devil's advocate, or to like elaborate a little bit on that more, Paul says, if you burn with, like, the only reason to get married is if you burn with passion. And so nuking the current Christianity culture view of like, it's going to be this magical switch that flips. And it's interesting. That's a dual. I think that can be a dual covert contract between God. Like, hey, I've been chased. As a man, I've been chased. And so when I get married, I'm going to have all this sex. So it's a covert contract, like between you and God and between you and your, future wife. But the, going from like a handshake, hello, phone number to banging like rock stars is a spectrum. And at some point in there, you have to start burning with passion in order to like trigger that, hey, we should get married. So there should be, like you said, the expectations. I think setting expectations is great, but unless you have some sort of physical indication like that's actually going to happen, then I wouldn't put any stock in it. Like, I've just learned over and over again, and the Red Pill talks about this, is like, it's actions, not words. And God even says that like a lot in the Old Testament. He's like, look, you say all the right words, you do all the right things. Like, they actually had the actions even, but they were giving him essentially starfish sex. And he's like, look, it's
elaborate along the lines of what you're saying there. Is it possible for God to have a covert contract with us?
No, because he knows we're just crappy, sinful people. He's like, look, you're like, I'm going on this mission, and if you join me, that's great. But if not, I don't need you. Like, I'm perfectly fine on my own, but I made you to glorify myself. Like, it would be great if you helped me out. And it's that same way with husband and wife. It should be that same way, like a little bit before. Well, obviously it has to be before marriage too. You have to set the tone for what you want to have happen in your marriage. So like when I'm dating in the future, when I'm dating my future wife, I'm definitely like, if I'm not getting to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm about to bang this girl's brains out and I'm like, we're not married, then that's definitely going to be like, okay, like, babe, we should get married. Like, maybe I'm not fingering her. Maybe I'm just making out and groping her. That, like, that kind of happened with one of my past 2 girlfriends. I don't want to name which one, just in case things get out. But anyways, yeah, I might get big. You never know. So, but we were at that point. Like, we were at that point where it's like, okay, too much farther, and this is definitely going to be crossing the line of sin. And so the church, like, I've never heard that in the church. I've never, ever heard that. They give so much more credence to it's a flip that switches, and it's like dead bedrooms.
Like you said, that's exactly what I experienced. There was a few times while we were dating, if we had not been fully committed to waiting until marriage to honor God, there'd have been a few incidents where we would end up banging in a movie theater, backseat of the car.
Did you grab her butt before you were married, Chuck?
Yeah.
So
okay.
There was a few times we were close. So yeah, the desire was definitely there, and that was a very good point that you made. Because yeah, setting expectations without there being desire there. And for anybody that ends up watching this, I'll just say, look, if that burning desire is not there, then you're not only are you missing what the Bible says about it, but you're missing out on something genuine, and you really should rethink the whole thing. But that being said, if there is that desire there, lay your expectations out clearly before, because let me tell you, I had both, and I have not been disappointed since, ever.
Yeah, so to go back to what I was asking, the question was, does God have covert contracts with us? And there's a couple things that I wanted to say on it. The first is that he can't possibly have a covert contract with us because his contracts, first off, he always makes them explicit throughout Scripture. If he's got to deal with us that he's expecting something, he's very, very abundantly clear. I'm going to tell you what I expect from you.
Yeah, like don't have sex with animals. That's pretty clear.
Yeah. So all throughout the Old Testament, God is telling us his expectations. Then he comes down in the person of Jesus and says, not only am I going to tell you what those are, I'm going to show you by becoming one of you so that you can see what it looks like to live out my expectations. And then after that, he says, and not only am I going to tell you and show you, but I'm going to put my spirit inside of you and turn you into my expectations, right? And so there's all that going on. Two is that God also knows the end result. And so the only real danger of a covert contract is how you react when it's not fulfilled, right? The whole point of a covert contract is that guys expect these things that aren't met, and that builds resentment and hatred and anger and all these things, right? And that's what causes the problem with the covert contract. If a guy had a covert contract and it was fulfilled by his wife every single time, what's the point? Like there's no harm in that at that point because he's getting what he wants out of it. But in God's situation, he knows the end result every time. He knows whether we're going to fulfill it or not. And so there's no cause for him to be bitter or hurt or angry because his expectations weren't met. I mean, he sets boundaries, but it's not like God thought we were going to do one thing and then we really did something else, right? Because he knows. But what I really want to say out of this is if God knows us so well that he is always fluent with how his people will react, what does that say for us as men and husbands who have women in our lives as to how well we ought to know our spouse in order to be able to make that judgment so that we don't have to play guesswork as, oh, is she going to respond properly this time or not? Or, I'm hoping this happens out of it, but maybe it won't, right? If you get to know your wife, and especially if you understand the red pill, that's half of what this whole red pill thing is about, right? Understanding women to a point where you can realistically predict, oh yeah, here's what they're going to respond positively to, here's what they're going to respond negatively to. Let's get to know them and how they work. And that really, the more you get to know it, the less you even have to think about covert contracts in the first place.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
So
Well, what comes to mind is, the idea of you can't negotiate desire, and it's the whole axiom of be attractive, don't be unattractive. And that is more than just to your wife, right? Like if we also believe all women are like that, then while there's going to be some particulars where, maybe my wife she really likes shoulders, like more than most women I've ever met. She really likes like good beefy shoulders. Okay, that's one particular thing. But like in general, the point is being like having a well-developed physique, being strong is a universally attractive thing to women. And so I think that learning how things work on the general can help with the avoiding covert contracts in the particular, because it's more than just knowing how your wife is behaving, because part of the problem too is women don't behave consistently as individuals. Now they can show patterns of behavior over time, but especially the guys who are new in marriage, their best benefit is to already have some working knowledge of how women in general operate, and then figure out how their woman in particular operates out of that knowledge. Because I think sometimes guys work backwards, where they say, well, my wife is like this, so all women are probably like this as well. And that can lead to what I think is a culture of confusion in the church, because guys are extrapolating their opinions, their advice, their sermons from their one particular example, not trying to look at it on a broader scope and saying, well, what does the Bible say? What does the culture indicate? What does the broader experience show of how women are like? And therefore, how should guys in general be raised up in the church to respond to these things and to lead in this way?
So that question of what does the Bible say is one of the things that I was thinking about before having the chat on this conversation today. And the whole foundation of a covert contract is that you have this expectation that's unspoken, right? And how often do we expect from God things like that, where we have this general unspoken, oh, well, if I act this way, then God will respond this way. That's where the whole prosperity gospel comes from, right? And so it occurs to me, like in James, where he talks about you do not have because you do not ask, right? How many times do we go through life, even though God knows what our prayers are and knows what we're thinking and how all of this beforehand, and yet we just kind of assume, oh, I don't really need to say it because God knows, and therefore I think God will just take care of me. But in reality, we have to actually take that initiative to say, no, this is something that I want. God wants it, not just for the sake of asking for its own purpose, but rather that God wants us to be in a position of, I guess, overtly communicating things so that we don't start to covertly communicate with each other. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, I think so. And it also matters the if you ask wrongly, like that's a reason you don't receive, and sometimes it's just not in God's like will for you to receive it. Like Paul was afflicted with something, and it was more glorifying for God to let him suffer. So, and then there's the whole, I haven't heard an answer from God on this, so what do I do? And it's like, well, general advice, it should be just make a decision and go with it, as long as that's as long as there's no moral right or wrong in this area.
So when I was in high school, you talk about, wrong ways to ask and all that. And for some reason it makes me think of this, and especially on the covert contract idea, because so many guys get in the mentality of saying, I'm just going to do these things and hopefully my wife will pick up on it and realize that I want to have sex. Well, there's this guy who they weren't even dating, but him and this girl go off on or meet up together at his house for studying math, right? And so I remember sitting at the lunch table hearing the girl recount the story afterward, and she's telling all of her other girlfriends, oh, it was, he comes over and we open our math books and we both turn to different pages. We were obviously not even looking at the math books. And he just looks over at me and says, are we going to have sex or what? And that was his way of initiating. Like there was no lead in, no gradual pretending to do math and then, kind of keno in the way. It was just, we're going to do it or what? And so that's kind of become a running joke with me and my wife from time to time. Just look at each other. We can do it or what?
But, that's awesome.
But it's just one of those ideas to show that like overt communication can work, and especially when a guy is initiating, I would rather you do it the wrong way than not at all. Right?
Well, and I think part of it, like I think being overt and being intentional and being direct is all like what we would consider alpha characteristics, right? But if you got the guy who doesn't have that as a part of his his understanding, he hasn't developed those parts of his life, and he just goes Rambo, and he says, oh, he listens to this right now and says, oh, okay. So John says, I would rather a guy be direct about things. And he goes to his wife, he's like, hey, we're going to do it or what? And she slaps him across the face. You pig, I can't believe you would just treat me like a piece of meat, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, I think that direct approach is certainly a very like alpha characteristic, and I think the results are good. I mean, I know many women and who have expressed that. I wish a guy would just be straight up with me and like, oh, they'll be watching a movie, that guy, man, he's really like, he tells her what he wants, and that's so hot right now, and I think that's genuine, but it's because it's that guy saying it. It's not because it's the weenie guy who is a stick figure saying it, because that's not coming from a place of attractive alpha quality. So I think, yes, direct approach is good, and I think part of it is like, the more somebody, I guess, rises in their SMV, the more they're able to do that successfully. Guys who are just naturally extraordinarily like handsome and jacked and work really hard in the gym, whatever, they don't have to jump through a lot of the same hoops that guys who are on that journey have to. And so, sometimes that leads to being in a weird place where they have no game, and that bites them in the tail later. But that direct approach works really well as you get toward those upper ends of the ladder, I guess.
That's a really good point. I wanted to piggyback on that and say, okay, so first, SMV, for anybody who doesn't know, I think that's the first time we've mentioned SMV on this podcast, but sexual market value, that's a man's just sexual appeal, plain and simple, composed of physique, career, charisma, social circle, etc. Now, the point I wanted to piggyback on is, if we have this overt contract, like, right, God's over in his contracts, like you were saying, John, how do most men respond with their overt contracts with their wife if they don't get their way, and how should they respond in comparison with how God responds in his overt contracts when we are basically like, yep, not on board with that, not going to do it?
What do you guys think?
Well, I think about the book of Proverbs and how it can be a covert contract factory. There's so many pieces of wisdom here, right? So like Proverbs, 12:11, whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. Well, I mean, there are plenty of farmers who have worked their land who lacked for bread. It's not a universal truism. This is generally a wise thing. And so it works most of the time and it's worth pursuing, but it's not a promise to the same degree that we have elsewhere in scripture, right? This is generally applied wisdom. And so I think we got guys who especially get introduced to the red pill, who they say, oh, well, if I, agree and amplify and I fog and I do all these things, then it's going to, I'm going to pass her test and it's going to generate desire. And then she's going to, jump my bones. And so they start building these same kind of covert contracts using general wisdom, not applying it to their circumstances wisely. And so then they have, again, these expectations. It doesn't work out for them. And so I think we see most guys, when they have these expectations that go unmet, they get frustrated, they get butthurt, and that ends up actually worsening their situation of being even less attractive to their wives. So until they can take it and just let it brush off their shoulder, laugh about it, amuse mastery maybe is the way to say it. But I think that if a covert contract gets unmet and you recognize that, then it's kind of a self-check, and then you laugh about it and move on, because in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that's enough chatting on covert contracts for one day. But it's been fun chatting with you guys today, and I look forward to having a conversation next week.
Awesome.
All right, peace out, Boy Scouts. Stay golden, pony boys.
Adios.